There are small things that, if you grew up in the late 1970s to the mid-1980s, you recognize instantly without needing any explanation, like leaving the house in the afternoon, saying something as simple as, "I'll be back before dark," and then disappearing from the world for a few hours. No phone, no one knew where you were, and no one really expected you to check in. You just rode your bike around the neighborhood until the streetlights came on, turned down a random street out of curiosity, or stopped by a friend's house. Knocked on the door if they weren't there. You moved on. No texting, no checking, no backup plan. You remember sitting by the radio, waiting for your favorite song so you could hit record on a cassette tape if the DJ talked over it. You had to start all over again. You remember calling friends on a landline, having to keep it short because their parents might pick up on the other end. You remember taking photos and then waiting a whole week to find out which ones turned out blurry and which ones managed to capture a moment. Everything was slower, but no one felt like they were missing out. That was simply how life was. Then somehow, very quickly and almost without warning, the world changed. You grew up right as the internet appeared, email arrived, and phones began to follow you everywhere, and you became a very particular kind of person. You understand what it means to wait, but you're also used to not having to wait anymore. You know what long stretches of silence feel like, but you also live in a world where a few minutes without a reply has become a signal. And there's something difficult to explain. You can adapt to all of it. Yet somewhere inside, you still feel that everything is moving faster than it needs to. It's not that you resist it, you live within it. But a part of you still remembers very clearly that life used to be different. And maybe that's exactly why you always feel like you're standing in between, not fully belonging to what has passed, yet not completely blending into what is coming next. If you look back at your childhood, there is one thing that is easy to overlook, not what you had, but what you didn't have. No internet, no notifications, no endless stream of entertainment always waiting in your hand. And that very absence was where many important things were formed. There were afternoons that felt endless, when you had nothing to do except figure out something to do. You wandered around the neighborhood, picked up a stick and turned it into a sword, drew chalk lines on the sidewalk and turned them into a racetrack, or simply sat on the steps, watching people pass by, with no clear purpose. No one called it self-development. No one said it was training creativity. Yet in those moments when nothing was happening, your imagination began to work. You also learned how to wait, but not in the restless, impatient way we experience today. You waited for a show to air again the following week. You waited for a song to come on the radio. You waited for a friend to arrive at the agreed time, with no way to ask, "Where are you?" And the strange thing is, you didn't feel left behind. Waiting wasn't a problem, it was simply a natural part of life. That created something that has become much rarer today. The ability to tolerate uncertainty. The ability to sit in a quiet space without needing to fill it immediately. You didn't have to check your phone every few minutes. Didn't have to look for something to kill time. Because back then, time wasn't something that needed to be killed. There's also something else you might not realize until later. Most of your world back then was direct, unmediated. You looked into people's eyes when you spoke. You could feel tone, silence, the smallest pauses in a conversation. If there was a misunderstanding, you had to face it. You couldn't disappear behind a message or a scene but no reply. You learned how to read a room, how to sense the atmosphere, how to repair after friction instead of avoiding it. And then there were moments when you were alone, not lonely, just without anyone around and without anything interrupting your thoughts. No notifications cutting in, no endless feed pulling your attention away. You were simply there, with yourself, and your thoughts had enough space to echo, expand, and then settle on their own. Looking back, you begin to realize that this kind of childhood left a very different mark. Not loud, not obvious, but enduring. It gave you the ability to be still without feeling uneasy, the ability to imagine without constant stimulation, and a kind of freedom that is hard to explain, the freedom from needing to always be connected, to always be seen, to always receive a response. And perhaps the most important thing is this: you didn't know you had something special at the time. You were simply living in it until the world changed, and you began to realize that this kind of childhood is slowly disappearing. And And then there came a point when everything began to change, not in a slow, gradual way that gave you time to adapt, but almost like a shift that happened right in the middle of you growing up. Not when you were too young to notice, and not when you were already fully settled, but precisely at the stage when you were just beginning to understand who you were. You may remember that moment very clearly, even though you couldn't name it at the time. The first time you sat in front of a computer connected to the internet, hearing the distinct sound of a dial-up modem, as if the entire world was connecting through an invisible thread. The first time you created an email address, it felt like opening a door into the future, where you could speak to someone without standing in front of them. But the important part wasn't the technology. It was the fact that you had a before. You knew what a world without the internet felt like. So when it arrived, it wasn't your default environment. It was a place you entered. You logged in, and then you logged out. There was a very clear boundary between real life and life on the screen. You went to school, met friends, and spoke face to face in one world. Then in the evening, you sat at the computer, entered chat rooms, created a username, and tried out a different version of yourself in another world. Two realities existed in parallel, and you moved between them as if stepping through a doorway. That created a very particular ability, a kind of bilingualism that not everyone has. You understand the language of physical presence, eye contact, pauses, silence, but you also learn the language of the digital world, how to express yourself through text, how to shape your identity, how to connect without being physically close. You don't fully belong to either one, but you can function in both. And then, over time, something began to change very quietly. The place you once logged into gradually became the place you live in. The internet was no longer a destination. It became an environment. Work started to move through email. Friends began to appear on screens. Memories started being stored as data. And the log-out door you were once familiar with slowly disappeared. But there is something you still carry with you, the memory that it once existed. You remember what it felt like when things had clear boundaries, when leaving the computer meant truly leaving it, when life had pauses, beginnings and endings, moments when you were completely unreachable, and that memory creates a very strange feeling in the present. You live in a world that is always connected, yet a part of you still expects interruptions, breaks. You reply to messages, participate in the rhythm of the digital world, but somewhere inside, you still feel that something is slightly too much, as if this world was never meant to run continuously like this. It's not that you resist it. You've adapted very well, but you are among the few who still remember that life once had an exit button. And perhaps that is exactly what allows you to maintain a subtle distance, a quiet awareness, while living inside a world that most people have never experienced in its earlier form. In the late 90s, adults talked about the future as something predictable. Go to college, find a stable job, and then gradually build a life. But by the early 2000s, things began to shift, not in a sudden collapse, but in a strange kind of slowdown that was hard to explain. Tech companies that had once been everywhere started to disappear. People who had graduated just a year or two before you, those who were supposed to be settled, were struggling to find work. You began to realize that the path ahead was no longer as clear as it had been described. But if 2000 was a signal, so the events of September 11 were a moment. If you were at that age, you remember exactly where you were when it happened. Maybe in a classroom, in a dorm room, or just starting your first job. Everything stopped. It wasn't just the news, it was a shared feeling that the world no longer operated the way you thought it would. Things that once seemed stable suddenly felt fragile. The sense of safety, something you had rarely even thought about before, became something you had to consider. You did not experience the events of September 11 as someone already grounded in life. You experienced it at the very beginning, when you were still trying to understand who you were and where you were going. And then, in the years that followed, you kept going. You looked for work, you adapted, you built things piece by piece. Maybe things didn't unfold exactly as planned, but you kept moving forward. And then came 2008. This time, there was no distance. If before you had only seen the signs from afar, now you were inside it. You saw your friends lose their jobs. You saw people who had just bought homes forced to sell them. You saw companies once considered safe begin to cut back. Maybe you didn't lose everything, but you could clearly see that it could happen. And this wasn't just an economic event. It changed the way you think. You began to understand that the moment you enter life can matter just as much as what you do within it. You no longer believed that simply doing everything right would naturally lead to the expected outcome. You started to pay attention to stability, but at the same time, you never fully trusted it. You still work, you still build, you still hope, but there is a very clear shift. You no longer assume that things will follow a straight line. You become used to preparing for the possibility that things might change direction, even when everything seems fine. And if you've ever felt that you carry a quiet sense of caution, even in the best of times, it may not be because you overthink. It may be because you began your life at a time when the world kept changing, right when you were learning to believe that it would stay stable. When you enter the workplace, there's something you gradually begin to notice, not all at once, but through small situations that repeat over time, that you are standing between two completely different ways of understanding the same thing. It might happen in a meeting, where an older manager expects everything to be handled in a very structured way. Fixed roles, clear processes, and defined time boundaries. Work is work, and off hours are off hours. And on the other side, younger colleagues are used to fast responses, constant communication, flexible workflows, and not being too concerned about the boundary between work and personal life. You understand both. You understand why an email sent at 10 p.m. might bother some people, and you also understand why, to others, it's just a normal part of the workflow. You know what it feels like to be present on time, to fulfill a defined role, and you're also used to adapting quickly, changing quickly, constantly updating, and somehow, you often find yourself in between, not because anyone assigned you that role, but because you're the only one in the room who understands what both sides are thinking. You explain to your superiors why certain things can no longer be enforced the way they used to be. You explain to younger colleagues why some things take time to build and cannot happen instantly. You adjust how you speak. You shift how you present ideas. You choose your words more carefully. And most of that goes unnamed. There is no job title for it. No KPI measures how you just translated a tense situation into a normal conversation. But if you pause for a moment, you'll realize you've done it many times. Outside of work, another kind of in-between plays out. You talk to your parents, people who are still used to a way of living that doesn't depend on technology, who need you to explain very basic things like apps, accounts, or how systems now work. And then you turn to your children, who have grown up with screens from the very beginning, in a world where everything is fast, accessible, and permanently recorded. You understand both. You know what it feels like to have a childhood that wasn't constantly monitored, but you also understand the risks of a world that is always connected. You try to preserve for your children a bit of the space you once had screen-free time, unstructured afternoons, but you also know that their world is no longer the same as yours. And this creates a very specific kind of pressure. You're not just living your own life. You are constantly adjusting between two different systems, an older one you still deeply understand, and a newer one you are required to function within. There isn't always a clear conflict. Sometimes it's just a subtle sense of fatigue that builds over time, from constantly having to read the situation, balance your responses, and understand things that each side assumes are obvious, but the other side does not. And if you've ever felt like you're often the connector in every situation, the one who makes things flow more smoothly, the one who helps others understand each other, then it may not be a coincidence. It's the natural result of being shaped by two different worlds. You don't just live between them. You are what allows them to function together. After everything you've been through, a childhood without constant connection, a coming of age shaped by rapid change, moments when the world wavered just as you were beginning to believe things would become stable, and a present life where you often stand in between to keep things balanced, you may sometimes wonder, why does everything feel just a little heavier for you than it does for others? But perhaps the answer isn't that you're missing something. It's that you've been carrying too many things at once, in a span of time that no other generation has experienced in quite the same way. You are among the few who still clearly remember what it felt like to live in a world that didn't require constant presence. You know that silence is not a void that needs to be filled. You understand the value of waiting, of relationships that don't need constant updates, of moments that are never recorded anywhere. And even though you now live in a very different world, those things are still within you. They haven't disappeared. They've simply grown quieter. So perhaps what you need is not to try to keep up with everything faster, or to become more aligned with the current pace of life. Perhaps what you need is to allow yourself to return to what you've always had, pauses that don't need a reason, moments when you don't respond immediately, conversations that aren't interrupted by a screen, not to resist this world, but to preserve a part of yourself within it. Because the truth is, you are not lost. You were simply shaped at a very particular point in history, where you learned how to live before everything became too fast, and then learned how to adapt when everything changed. And that is what makes you a rare kind of person. Someone who can move between two worlds without losing a sense of what is real. If there is one thing you can carry with you after all of this, perhaps it is something very simple. You don't have to move faster to belong. You only need to slow down a little, to remember that you were never left behind. If you recognize yourself in what was just shared, perhaps you're not the only one carrying those memories. We just rarely talk about them. I'd really love to hear your story. A simple, everyday memory you still remember clearly, a moment when you realized the world had changed, or just the feeling of always standing between two different rhythms of time. Share it in the comments, because sometimes just reading a single line from someone else is enough to remind you that you're not alone in this experience. And if you'd like to continue conversations like this, the kind that aren't loud but resonate deeply, you can subscribe to the channel. Not to keep up with anything, but to occasionally pause, reflect, and understand yourself a little more clearly in a world that's changing too fast.